Infrastructure is being reorganized. Deck architectures are being renegotiated. Port access agreements in West and East Africa are being competed over by multiple global powers simultaneously. The United States understands this. AFRICOM understands this, which is precisely why the vote against reparations recognitions is not merely a moral position, it is a strategic one. Acknowledging the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity opens a legal and political architecture that could redirect resource flows, restructure debt, relationships, and fundamentally reorder the terms on which Africa and the diaspora engage with Western institutions.
Afro-descendant Ali, yeah, we writing history. Afro-descendant Ali for the whole world to see. Oh yeah.
Peace and blessings, everyone in this room right now. Whether you're watching from Accra or Atlanta, from Lagos or London, from Nairobi or New Orleans, I need you to know that what we're about to walk through together is not simply a news story. This is a moment in the long arc of a struggle that predates every government, every institution, and every international body currently debating its outcome. The United States of America, the most powerful nation state on the face of this earth, cast a vote at the United Nations against formally recognizing the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity. Not a mistake of history, not a regrettable chapter, a crime. And the United States, on the record, in front of the world, said no. Now, I want to be clear about something before we go into a single frame further. This is not a moment of despair. This is actually a moment of extraordinary clarity. Because when power tells you exactly who it is, without ambiguity, without apology, that is not a setback. That is information. And what you do with accurate information is what separates those who build futures from those who simply react to headlines. We are working from a conversation that took place on Roland Martin's YouTube channel, one of the most important spaces for Black political thought operating right now. In that conversation, voices like Rebecca Carruthers, President and CEO of the Fair Election Center, brought the international weight of democratic infrastructure to this discussion. And Patrick D. Schaefer, political philosopher and public scholar, gave us the intellectual architecture to understand why a vote like this is not an anomaly, but a pattern with very deep historical roots. What we are going to do tonight is take their conversation, anchor it in the documents, the treaties, the charters, the official records, and make sure that by the time you leave the stream, you're not just informed, you are equipped. So sit in, get comfortable, turn the notifications off, because we are going to take this slowly. We're going to take this seriously, and we are going to let the evidence speak for itself.
Who are first, second, third generation in this country, where if it goes down in this country, they know their country of recent origin will stand up and say something. They know that that country's president or premier or ambassador is going to talk to this government about how their people are being treated in this country.
Now, I want to really sit with what's being said here, because the language of first generation, second generation, third generation carries an enormous amount of weight depending on who is speaking it and who is being spoken about. When we talk about first and second generation immigrants, the assumption embedded in that framing is voluntary migration. A family that made a decision to move, to seek opportunity, to build a new life across borders. That's one story. But when we apply that generational language to the descendants of the African slave trade, we are doing something categorically different. We are counting the generations of a people who were displaced by force, whose removal from the African continent was not a migration, it was military extraction. And I want you to understand that distinction deeply, because it is the foundation of every reparations argument that will follow. There is a document that every serious student of African geopolitics should have read. The Constitutive Act of the African Union, adopted in the year 2000 in Lomé, Togo, at Article 4G, enshrines as a founding principle of the continental body non-interference by any member state in the internal affairs of another. Why are we referencing this document here? Because that principle, non-interference, is not a modern invention. It is the codification of a standard that was catastrophically violated 4 centuries before the AU even existed to articulate it. Every kingdom raided, every family divided, every trade route disrupted by European slave-catching operations, each of those was an act of interference in the internal affairs of African peoples. The AU didn't create this principle. It recognized a principle that was being bled out of Africa before 1884 in Berlin, long before 1652 in the Cape. So when you hear someone counting generations, first, second, third, the question you should be asking is, which generation was it when the interference began? Because every generation since the interference is a generation still living with its consequences. And those consequences are not abstract. They are measurable in wealth gaps, in land ownership, in institutional representation, in the very passport one carries or cannot carry. The African Union's 6th region, the African Diaspora, was formally recognized as a constituency precisely because the AU understood that the generational wound of forced displacement does not heal itself by counting time. It heals through political and material redress. Stay with us, because that is exactly where this conversation is going.
Get that. And so to even see Ghana stand up and advocate for Black Americans in that way is so powerful, because we don't have that. We don't get that, because as far as people are concerned, we didn't have a history, as far as some people are concerned.
Now, here is where I need you to pay very close attention, because what Ghana did at that podium deserves to be understood in its full geopolitical weight, not simply applauded as a feel-good moment. In 2019, President Nana Akufo-Addo launched what became known globally as the Year of Return, a formal state-sponsored invitation to the African diaspora, marking 400 years since the first enslaved Africans arrived on the shores of what is now the United States. Over 1.8 million diasporans visited Ghana that year. The Ghanaian government passed the right of abode legislation, giving Afro-descendants a formal legal pathway to residency. This was not symbolic tourism. This was a sovereign African state reaching across the Atlantic and saying, "We recognize you, we claim you, come home." That is what made Ghana's advocacy at the United Nations so significant. Ghana was not simply speaking on behalf of an abstract principle. It was speaking from a position of active, documented, state-level engagement with the African diaspora. Now, let's look at the document on the screen. The AFRICOM 2023 Posture Statement to Congress, page 12, uses the phrase by, with, and through African partners. This is the language the United States military uses when it describes how it conducts operations across the African continent, by, with, and through African partners, meaning we use African governments, African institutions, African soldiers to advance American strategic objectives. That is the operational doctrine of a command that currently maintains a presence across more than 29 African countries. The United States is willing to work by, with, and through Africa when it comes to mineral extraction corridors, counterterrorism operations, and military basing rights. But the moment an African government, Ghana, a partner and ally, a country with an American military cooperation agreements, steps to United Nations for to say that enslaved Africans and their descendants deserve recognitions as victims of a crime against humanity, the United States votes no. Let that land. The partnership goes one way, and Ghana, in standing up anyway, demonstrated a clarity of moral purpose that is worth studying carefully. That is leadership. That is what sovereignty in action looks like.
I think about the last time I was in Portugal, I took a African tour of Portugal tour, and it was led by several Africans. And what was interesting about that tour, they really pointed out how Africans. And what was interesting about that tour, they really pointed out how across Portugal, they don't talk about their role in the slave trade.
Portugal. Let's talk about Portugal. Because if you've been there, if you have walked those streets, you understand that this is a country that has built an entire national aesthetic, an entire architecture of identity around the global reach of its age of exploration. The blue and white azulejo tiles, the Padrão dos Descobrimentos monument on the Lisbon waterfront. Those are monuments to a particular version of Portuguese history. What they do not prominently feature is the other side of that ledger. The facts are documented, cataloged, and uncontested. In 1441, under the direction of Prince Henry, known in Western historiography as the Navigator, Portuguese sailors Antão Goncalves and Nuno Tristão brought the first captive Africans to Portugal, seized from the Mauritanian coast. 3 years later, in 1444, the largest single auction of enslaved Africans in European history up to that point took place in the port of Lagos in the Algarve region of southern Portugal. The chronicler Gomes Ains de Zarura recorded it in detail. The families separated, the children torn from their mothers, the wailing that could not be stopped. The scene is documented. It is not speculation, and by 1482 had constructed Elmina Castle on the Gold Coast, what is now Ghana, the first European slave trading fortification in sub-Saharan Africa. From that castle and the network of fortresses that followed, an estimated 5 to 6 million Africans were extracted from the continent under Portuguese operation, more than any other European nation. Now, bring back that AU article 4G, non-interference by any member state in the internal affairs of another. Every stone in Elmina Castle is a monument to interference. Every transaction, every branding iron, every ship manifest bearing African names renamed to Portuguese inventory numbers. Each one was a violation of sovereignty so total, so comprehensive that the African Union, more than 500 years later, had to write the principle of non-interference into its founding charter, as if to say, never again. When the speaker reflects on being in Portugal, understand they are standing in the physical landscape where the administrative machinery of African dispossession was first invented, first funded, first celebrated. That reflection deserves every ounce of historical weight we can bring to it.
The role that Portugal played in kicking off the transatlantic slave trade, and when I've done similar tours in France, it's a cognitive dissonance. So, am I surprised that those European nations who primarily benefited from the transatlantic slave trade, aka the greatest human trafficking in human history?
The transatlantic slave trade did not begin spontaneously. It was authorized in writing by the highest ecclesiastical and secular power on earth at the time. And that is a fact that many people have never been taught, because it is a fact that fundamentally changes the moral and historical calculus of what happened. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the Papal Bull Dum Diversas, directing the King of Portugal to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. 3 years later, in 1455, the same Pope issued Romanus Pontifex, which extended this license permanently and specifically to sub-Saharan Africa. The Catholic Church, the single most powerful institutional authority in the Western world, put its seal on the enslavement of African people as a source of doctrine. Then, in 1494, Portugal and Spain signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the non-European world between themselves along a meridian line. Africa was not consulted. No African king, no African council, no African governance structure was invited to Tordesillas. They simply divided the world and extracted from it. Now look at the document on this screen. The Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999, Section 5, Executive Powers of the Federation. Why does this matter? Because the coastlines from which millions were extracted, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, the Niger Delta region, those were modern Nigeria. They are territories that today exercise constitutional sovereign authority with elected governments, with formal legal structures, with international diplomatic recognition. The people taken from those shorelines had no constitutional protection. They had no executive power, no treaty representation, no one writing papal bulls in their defense. The contrast between modern Nigerian constitutional sovereignty and the utter legal nakedness of Africans extracted from those same shores is not a minor irony. It is the precise argument for why reparations are a historical obligation. The crime was structured, authorized, and executed by institutions with all the power of law. The remedy must also be structural. Anything less is not justice, it's theater.
Absolutely. Patrick, your thoughts? I think it's pretty on brand for the United States. They've been pretty consistent. I think that the mere fact that we're talking about reparations and redress and repair is because that slavery has an afterlife, and there's a logic to that afterlife.
Pretty on brand for the United States. I want you to appreciate how precise that phrase is, because it is not an insult. It is a historical observation backed by a consistent evidentiary record. Let us trace the brand. In 2001, the United Nations convened the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, arguably the most significant international gathering on reparations for slavery and colonialism ever assembled. The United States and Israel walked out before the conference concluded, refusing to engage with language that characterized slavery and the slave trade as crimes against humanity. That was 2001. Fast forward to the present vote. The same position, the same outcome, held for over 2 decades. This is not an anomaly, this is consistency. A brand, by definition, is a consistent promise. And the United States has consistently promised at every international forum where the question has been posed that it will not allow the global community to formally characterize the enslavement of African people as a crime against humanity requiring a remedy. Now, the document on the screen, the post-World War II Atlantic Order, is fragmenting. This is not a fringe analysis. It is the consensus view of strategic institutions from Rand Corporation to the African Development Bank. Infrastructure is being reorganized. Deck architectures are being renegotiated. Port access agreements in West and East Africa are being competed over by multiple global powers simultaneously. The United States understands this. AFRICOM understands this, which is precisely why the vote against reparations recognitions is not merely a moral position, it is a strategic one. Acknowledging the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity opens a legal and political architecture that could redirect resource flows, restructure debt, relationships, and fundamentally reorder the terms on which Africa and the diaspora engage with Western institutions. The vote is not about history. It is about who controls the future. And the reorganization happening right now. Imports in mineral corridors, in food supply chains. What will determine whether the next 50 years look different from the last 400 years? That is what is at stake in this single vote.
And so I think that it is a great conversation, and I'm more interested in what does material justice look like within this context.
Now we arrive at the most important question of this entire discussion, and I want you to understand that the speaker frames it exactly right. They're not asking whether the conversation was great. They're asking what material outcomes does it produce? Because a conversation, no matter how eloquent, no matter how historically accurate, no matter how emotionally resonant, a conversation without material consequence is just an event. And our people have attended enough events. Look at the document on this screen. The ECOWAS Revised Treaty of 1993, Article 58, charges member states to work to safeguard and consolidate relations conducive to the maintenance of peace, stability, and security within the region. Now, peace, stability, and security in a region that saw millions of its people extracted over 4 centuries cannot be built on diplomatic language alone. The framers of the ECOWAS Treaty understood that the fragmentation of West Africa its artificial borders, its disconnected economies, its dependency relationships with former colonial powers was itself an inheritance of the slave trade and colonialism. ECOWAS was a material response to that inheritance, a customs union, a common currency aspiration, a free movement protocol, a mutual security framework. That is what material looks like. So here is where we leave you. The reparations movement is at a crossroads. The most honest thing any serious thinker in this space can say is that recognition without redistribution is not reparation. Recognition is the beginning of the sentence. Material transfer is the period at the end. What does material transfer look like? It looks like debt cancellations for nations whose economies were built on enslaved African labor and never compensated. It looks like land access and right of return frameworks like Ghana has already begun. It looks like direct investment pipelines from the diaspora into continental African structure. It looks like control over mineral corridors rather than perpetual extraction for foreign entities. The ECOWAS Treaty points toward what regional solidarity can achieve when it is backed by political will and institutional architecture. The question for this generation, for everyone watching right now, is whether we will build the institutions, form the alliances, and hold the line with the same consistency that those who oppose us have demonstrated for over 200 years, because they have been consistent. The only variable is whether we will be.